So today I'm going to show you guys how I personally installed Klipper on my SV06. I used the firmware from Spinix Guy, which I will put the link to everywhere I went down in the description. So I'm just going to jump into this so we can get started. So the first thing that I did was I made sure my Sovol was shut down. And then what I did was I took this clipper.bin file and I placed it on a blank SD card. I then placed that SD card in the SD card reader, and then I turned on my SV06. And then when the SV06 powered on, it read that bin file, and then it updated the firmware on my main board. And I let it stay on for about a minute before I turned off the SV06 and then pulled the SD card. And once the SD card has been removed and the SV06 has been powered down, we're now going to power it back on again. And when it comes back up, your display is just going to be blank. You're not going to see any writing, you're not going to see anything. It's just going to be blank. So I decided that I was going to install Maincell OS, and I was going to use the Raspberry Pi Imager. It's a great program. The one thing I like about Maincell OS is that it has Klipper pre-installed, which is a great feature. It just saves me a bit of time on the back end and allows me to get done with my projects a little quicker. It's kind of nice. And so once I've selected my OS and my destination, I'm going to pre-configure the OS by adding a username and password. And then what I do here is I set up my Wi-Fi. That way, when the, we put the SD card in the Raspberry Pi and it boots up, I'll have SSH enabled, and I'll have it connected to my network, which is just a great time saver right there. That way we can just run it headless and get to work. And so I've sped up some of the installation process here just for saving time and shortening the video, because it's more important to get the information out than it is to watch all this stuff. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to install Git. The next thing that I'm going to install is this fantastic tool. It's called the Klipper Installation Update Helper. And this is going to allow us to make really, really fast work of the install process, updates, all sorts of stuff. It has a lot of options and a lot of capabilities. One thing that I do have on my Raspberry Pi is a touch screen. So right now I am installing the software for that. But later on through the video, I will be doing most of everything through the web interface. I'm going to make an assumption that not everybody has a touchscreen. And so when we calibrate it and we go through that process, we will not be using the touchscreen interface, we'll be using the web interface. Okay, Klipper screen's installed. I'm going to go into the menu, choose update, and I'm going to update everything that's installed that needs to be updated. So now that I have everything updated, this is where I connected my USB cable from the Raspberry Pi to the SV06. And the command that I'm doing right now is actually going to tell me what port the USB is connected to on the Raspberry Pi. And we're going to need this information because we need to change a couple things in our printer configuration file, which is this information right here. And if we don't change this information in the printer config, Klipper's never going to be able to talk to the SV06. So that's what we need to do. So right back now we're at the Spinix guys GitHub, and what I'm going to need to get from there is there's a config file. And what I did was I just went ahead and I downloaded it to my the zip file to my PC, and then I'm going to go in here and I'm actually going to paste that information that we just got from the command, the port location, and we're going to paste it into this configuration file, and then we're going to save it. And then once we're done saving this file, we also need to rename it to printer.cfg. And the way I'm going to move it, I'm going to use FileZilla. And there are many ways to do this, but in this particular instance, I'm using FileZilla. And once we connect, we're going to go to the printer data config folder, and that's where we're going to move our printer.cfg file to. Yeah, we're really in the home stretch right here. Once we get our modified printer configuration file moved over to the printer data config folder and renamed, we'll be ready to go into the Klipper web interface and restart it. And once they connect and restart properly, your blue screen on your SV06 will have a readout. And that's when you know everything's good. And if you don't see this, then you know there's something wrong with your configuration file. So now that we got it installed, Klipper isn't what I would call usable right out of the box. So what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be installing macros from a GitHub repository that I found from an individual called Jay Shu, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but I will have a link down in the description. And what this is basically doing is it's copying a folder into our printer data config folder, and once it's in there, as we can see, Klipper macros. And what we're going to do is we are going to edit the config file, and we're going to copy some information into the configuration file and then restart Klipper so it will be able to see these macros. And so that's what we're going to do right now. Okay, so now we're in the printer.cfg file, and what I'm doing is copying in the configuration portion that is available on the JShoe GitHub repository. Once you copy that in place, you're going to save your printer.cfg, and then we're going to restart the Klipper. And then at that point, we'll have all these new macros available to us. And all they do is just enhance the usability of Klipper. Makes it a lot more user-friendly. So another thing we need to do in the printer.cfg file is we need to point it to the folder where it actually saves the G codes that you upload to Klipper through the web interface. And so what I'm doing here is I'm entering the correct path that my Klipper installation uses to store its G codes. If we don't change this and we try to upload a G code through Klipper, it's just going to give us an error. And obviously that's not going to be very good if we want to print something. So now basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to restart Klipper, and once we do that, we're going to see a whole bunch of new macros that are now available to us that weren't available before. And these macros just help us do things a lot faster. And there they are. Now here I'm just going into my printer.cfg file, and you can do this right through the Klipper interface, which is really nice. And the only thing I'm doing right now is I'm just putting in like a little section description here that says this is the macro section, because later on in this video I'm going to add a couple more macros, and I'm going to put them right down in this area. So that's all I'm doing, just creating a placeholder. And you don't have to do this. This is just something I like to do. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to modify the Moonraker configuration file, and I'm adding this configuration text from the JShoe GitHub, and I'm going to uh, copy that into the Moonraker config file. And basically what we're going to do is we have the ability to update the system from the Klipper interface. And what I want it to do is basically notify me when he has made any changes or updates to his macros. And when that occurs, we'll be notified that there will be an update available, and we'll run it. We just click on one of these blue things where it says update, and then we'll go through the process and we'll update it, and that's it. Interesting though, we did update um, these systems through the Klipper install and update helper, and why everything is updated there. Uh, the Klipper interface showed that it wasn't updated, but as soon as we click update, it instantly says, oh yeah, it's updated. And that's why it's moving so fast here. We're actually, this video part hasn't been sped up. We're actually moving in real time right now. So this is just a good thing to do. It also gives you kind of an idea of how it looks when it does the updates. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add a couple more SV06 specific macros. The macros that we installed earlier were not necessarily SV06 specific, but this one is. This is the mechanical gantry calibration. This is where you when we click it, it's going to take the z-axis all the way to the top of the gantry, and it's going to slam it into the top. It's going to hold it for about 10 seconds, and it's going to take it back down. And if you're familiar with the stock firmware that's on the SV06, you should be very familiar with that movement during the calibration process. But basically what I'm doing here is we're just like before. I'm just going to FTP it into a new folder, macro folder, and then I'm going to go into the printer.cfg file, and from there I'm going to modify it and add those macros to the macro section that I created, and then we're going to restart Klipper, and then we'll have that gantry calibration. So that'll be good. And also the link for Basa Monitor, which is the guy that actually he has instructions and some other stuff that you can use for the SV06 and the Klipper install, and I will put the link to that down in the description as well. Okay, so now that we've FTP'd the files to the new folder that we created in the printer data config folder, I'm going to go inside the printer CFG again, and I'm going to add those macros in there. I'm also not only adding the new macro folder, but I'm actually going to uncomment one of the lines here. And this is for a quick bed mesh. Basically what it does, it just calibrates the area of the bed that you're going to print on. And I don't really use that feature all the time, but I like to have it if I need it. So this is the first step in the calibration process. We're going to issue a G28 command. This allows us to use Klipper to move the extruder around on the axis. And once we do that, then we can do the calibrate the gantry command, which is actually one of the macros we added earlier, which would be one of the second step on here. But I did not get that part on camera. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to PID tune the heater bed. Now this step seems to take forever. It's a very long process. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to speed this portion of the video up. The next part of the calibration process is the extruder heater. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is we're going to do the home, the G28, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the parts cooling fan at 25%, and I'm going to set the target heat at 245 degrees Celsius. So this also takes a very long time to do this calibration. Not as long as the heater bed, but still quite a long time. So once again, I'm going to speed this up, and always remember after each portion of the calibration process, always save your config. Now we're in the second of the last step of the calibration. So the first thing that we're going to want to do in order to adjust our Z offset is to set the bed temperature at 60 degrees Celsius. And then we're going to set the extruder temperature at 180 degrees Celsius. Now it's very important before we enter in the probe calibration command that we let those temperatures reach their target. So it needs to be at 60 degrees C and 180 degrees C. Okay, so now that we've reached our target operating temperatures, we're going to issue the G28 home command. And then once it's done doing this, then we can issue the probe calibrate command. Okay, now that we've entered in the G28 home command and that's finished, we're now going to do the probe calibrate. Now this is what allows us to set the Z offset. Now I personally don't use a piece of paper to set this up. I actually use a feeler gauge, and the feeler gauge that I use is a 0.002 inch or a 0.05 millimeter feeler gauge, and I get very good results with that. However, your mileage may vary. Everybody's printer is a little different, but that's where my sweet spot is on the two Sovol SV06 printers that I have. Now, this takes a little bit of time, especially since I didn't do it on the touchscreen. I did it on the computer, and the computer sits a little bit away from the printer, and so it's just kind of awkward. I have to, you know, put the feeler gauge under there, then walk back to the computer, click it a couple times, and it was very time consuming this way. But once you get it where it needs to be, you're pretty much good to go. And then at that point, we can move on to the uh, the bed mesh uh, leveling. But that's going to be our final step. So I feel like this is probably the step that brings everything together. So what we need to do is we need to bring the temperatures up to 60 for the bed and 180 for the extruder. And once they reach their target temperatures, then we'll be able to start the bed mesh procedure. Okay, now that our temperatures have reached, just like before, we have to do a G28 home. And you'll notice that the coordinates in the tool set were oranged out for a few minutes. And when they're orange like that, we can't move the extruder around any of the axis. So we have to wait till that turns blue. Okay, so now that we're done with this portion and the homing, we can move on to creating the bed mesh. Okay, now it's time to create that bed mesh. And this does a 10 by 10 like coordinate square when it calibrates its mesh against your bed. And so this is going to take a few minutes. But while this is going, I want you to notice or take a look at the toolhead drop-down box. And right above the X, Y, and Z coordinates, you're going to see a little thing in the upper left. It says position absolute. And to the right of that, you'll notice there's nothing there. Okay? So this is something where when I first started out, I didn't know. And so once somebody told me, like, hey man, you got to load your bed mesh, after it's created and you load your bed mesh, that mesh is going to appear to the right of position absolute. So if you don't see the name of your bed mesh there, um, you're not going to have a good first layer. So that's something to think about. You must load that bed mesh after it's created. Okay, so thanks to the power of editing, we're able to shorten up the bed mesh calibration quite a bit. So now, if you notice, under the toolhead, you're going to see position absolute, and to the right of it, you're going to see default. So now that we know the bed mesh has been loaded. And so now that it's loaded, we also want to save what we just did as well. And so we're going to do another save config. Okay, and now we have a bed mesh. It's created. We just loaded it. Um, and that's what it looks like. When it did that 10 by 10 grid calibration, it basically maps out your bed. And as you can see, mine definitely has some high spots that need to be taken care of. So you can actually use that as a tool too to actually correct some deficiencies you have in your bed, which is kind of nice. But this is basically it. This is your basic setup on how to get Klipper going. I hope it helps, and happy printing, everyone.